Again, if you're going to ask me about Newcastle United, I'm going to take a drink of water first, and I'm going to calm myself because this has occupied my time for best part of 3 months and longer. If we go back to the long history of Newcastle takeovers, if, and it's a big if Saudi Arabia is somehow involved in the acquisition of Newcastle United, then it is contentious because Saudi Arabia, in very simple terms, is a contentious country. We know that historically they do things very differently in Saudi Arabia, and I'm not going to judge. I'm just going to say, we know, for example, that they still execute people. We know, for instance, that there is still significant gender segregation. We know that more recently the country has been engaged in a war in Yemen, which has been referred to by international aid bodies as being the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And I think those things are fact, they're factual. So there's no value judgment there. They are factual. You got to keep in mind too that as a nation, this is not a liberal democracy in the same way as Britain or Germany or Sweden or the United States. This is an authoritarian country. So there are no free elections. In fact, there aren't elections. There is a ruling family, and the ruling family makes decisions on the basis of what they think is best for the country, for the population, for themselves. And so in the context of all of those things, if Saudi Arabia is to buy into Newcastle United, that baggage comes with it. Abu Dhabi, the owners of Manchester City, you're talking about a very, very small emirate, a city-state of 1.8 million people. Qatar is not a part of the Emirates. It's a country in its own right. A population of between 2.5 and 3 million people. Saudi Arabia is a population of nearly 35 million people, with an armed forces consisting of 250,000 troops, sailors, and so forth. So this is a bigger, more powerful, economically stronger country. You got to keep in mind too, Saudi Arabia is one of the two big power bases in the Middle East, the other one being Iran. Saudi Arabia and Iran are diametrically opposed to one another. They are enemies. They're involved in fighting what are called proxy wars in places like Yemen, also in Syria to a certain extent too. And so this is a very, very different proposition to Qatar and Abu Dhabi. One of the tangible effects of that, I think, is that for football, I think, is that to protect themselves, Qatar and Abu Dhabi move some of their assets offshore. And they do that because they're very vulnerable. They're vulnerable to attack from Iran. They're vulnerable to attack from Saudi Arabia. They're vulnerable to attack from terrorist groupings. And so what they do is they move some of their assets offshore. So they can lavish resources upon the likes of Manchester City. And if you look at the way in which Abu Dhabi has used Manchester City as a route into the real estate sector in Manchester, you'll now, for those people who go to Manchester regularly, you'll see, it's a skyscraper city now. And these skyscrapers are residential accommodation, sometimes funded by Abu Dhabi. And that generates rent, and that's long term, and that's Abu Dhabi's income for the future. Saudi Arabia doesn't need to move its assets offshore in the same way because it's bigger and stronger and more powerful. So I don't envisage there being a spending spree if Saudi Arabia buys Newcastle. I don't anticipate there being a spending spree in the same way as we've seen at Manchester City or Paris Saint-Germain. In governance terms, how concerned should they be? Well, given that their fit and proper person test essentially is a financial test, they shouldn't be concerned at all, because it's no, not within the scope of that test to consider the ethics and morals of different owners. You know, to be fair to Newcastle United and Saudi Arabia, we've seen some dodgy individuals getting involved in football club ownership in the past. And the Premier League waved that through because they said, hey, fit and proper person test, it's not our concern. But I think where it does become a concern for the Premier League is the precedent that it sets. It sets a challenge to their established governance mechanisms. I think quite rightly so. A lot of organisations, a lot of people are saying, well, hey, this test shouldn't just be about money, it should be about ethics and morals and standards. You know, we're seeing the same kinds of calls to FIFA when it awards World Cup hosting rights, and so this now is part of the landscape. It's part of what I think organisations like the Premier League has to do. It's not just about money; it has to be about other things too. But for me personally, given my background in marketing, I wonder to what extent this is going to reflect badly upon the brand, because there will be people across the world who will question the appeal or the attractiveness or the morality of a league, of a brand that associates with people and organizations and countries that are accused of engaging in activities that we deem to be unacceptable, immoral, unethical. And so in branding terms, I think there's a big issue there for the Premier League. What I do find particularly significant in branding terms about all of this, though, is given that the Premier League is still saying no, nothing to do with us. You know, it may well be that Britain and Western Europe, with our liberal democracies and our liberal values, maybe we're just not the key target market anymore. You know, maybe the authoritarian regime, or countries in which there are authoritarian regimes like China and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and elsewhere in the world, maybe they're more important to the Premier League now than British fans or European fans. So that may be an inconvenient reality, an inconvenient truth for people who are calling for this, is that, you know, with our liberal values, we think this is bad. But in other parts of the world where they're prepared to spend money on the Premier League through TV rights deals and sponsorships and acquisitions of clubs, you know, maybe it's just not important. My view still at this point, on the 27th of April, when you're interviewing me, is I remain unconvinced that this deal will go through. I could be wrong, but I remain unconvinced. And the reason that I'm unconvinced is that, having monitored Saudi Arabian sport policy for the best part of a decade, this is a highly unusual move. So it's not in keeping with what Saudi Arabia has been doing until now. And so if Public Investment Fund or some other Saudi Arabian entity buys Newcastle United, that will be completely unexpected. It would mark a major change in direction. It's something that I didn't necessarily see coming. Now, what's significant, I think, this has to be set against the backdrop of a Saudi Arabian government that was investing heavily in domestic assets. So Saudi Arabia has been, or is spending, I think, I would estimate something upwards of $1 trillion on three big cities, of which sport is going to be part. And what they want to do is they want to, for example, stage combat sports at one of these cities. So we all know already about the Anthony Joshua fight. Some people will know about mixed martial arts taking place in Saudi Arabia. WWE has been there. So all the spending up until now has been focused on domestic assets. There has been some focus on football. In particular, the Saudi Arabian government has been trying to privatize its top clubs. So that's been the big program, to get them into private hands. They've wanted to do this because they want the clubs to be stronger, better run, more commercially viable. You've got to keep in mind that some of those top Saudi Arabian clubs, like Al Hilal, for example, draws big crowds not far short of Newcastle United. Al Hilal won the Asian Champions League last season in November. And what the Saudi Arabian government has seemed to want to do so far is, when you talk about the Deloitte top 30 annual money league, they want, you know, the likes of Al Hilal in that top 30. So that's all significant. Oil prices are falling. Saudi finances are really shot to pieces right now. 10 days ago, they went into the debt market to sell their debt. The value of their sovereign wealth fund has declined significantly. So there's a big part of all of this that is me thinking, I just don't get this. I just don't get what they're doing here. So if they buy Newcastle United, I just don't think, you know, we're not going to see Mbappe scoring a hat-trick, you know, that takes Newcastle top of the league on Boxing Day 2020. I just don't think we're going to see it. I think what we will see, if it takes place, is obviously some spending. But my view is the lever for the Saudi Arabians that I see in all of this, if they're going to buy the club, is some of the economic opportunities around the northeast. So as we've already mentioned, Abu Dhabi through Manchester City has got a great relationship with Manchester City Council. This has resulted in Abu Dhabi buying land, building real estate, making money from that real estate. I think we'll see a similar thing in Newcastle. There'll be real estate opportunities, infrastructural opportunities. The interesting one for me is if Brexit goes ahead, will the Port of Tyne become a free port? And I think that's absolutely crucial. So some of the biggest and most important free ports in the world are in the Gulf region, in places like Saudi Arabia. And what wouldn't surprise me is if the Public Investment Fund is involved in the acquisition of Newcastle, you know, give it 5 years, give it 10 years, you know, potentially what we'll see is public investment funding going into the Port of Tyne, going into infrastructural developments, possibly, you know, maybe even links to high speed too, if we see that link from you know, Birmingham through Manchester up to Newcastle taking place. You know, it wouldn't surprise me if Saudi Arabian money in 10 years' time has become involved in that kind of thing. So for me, this is not about football. I think football is just the means to an end. I don't think football is the end in itself.